Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to start by thanking Hobart and William Smith colleges for the kind welcome and their generous hospitality they've shown us throughout this tournament. Many universities currently pick people as the finished product at the end of their university education. However, the obstacles that have faced these people in getting to this point are so different that we cannot properly describe selecting them on the basis of ability, on the basis of their qualities at that moment, is truly meritocratic. I'm going to make 3 points in this speech. Firstly, I'm going to discuss what those obstacles facing these diverse groups are. Secondly, I'm going to show you why universities don't cater for them now. And thirdly, I'm going to argue about the benefits of this policy. Before I do that, here is what this policy entails in 5 steps. Firstly, we think that what these diverse groups are differ according to society. For example, in the UK, it's probably best to do by socioeconomic backgrounds. Probably in the US, there's probably going to be a racial criteria that we'll probably assess. We think that affirmative action policies of the type used in UC Cal are exactly the type of thing that we stand behind, but we also think that we should do this for socioeconomic groups. Secondly, how large will this be? We think that in the UK, for example, something like 30 to 40% should come from socioeconomically disenfranchised backgrounds, and in the US, we think that you should have representation that falls close to, not necessarily equal to, but close to the proportion in the general population. Thirdly, how are we going to do this? We think that we should still have some criteria for achievement, but we're happy to relax these criteria for achievement for these diverse groups. Fourthly, we're willing to offer significant financial aid and scholarships. We think these should be targeted towards groups who are likely to have the most significant financial problems. Fifthly, we think it's important that we do this to private institutions. We already legislate for private institutions. We already say that they can't be monoethnic, for example. And when they receive tax breaks and when they are social institutions, we think it's important they're held to the same laws as the rest of society. So what are these obstacles? At the moment, the structures of discrimination mean that people from diverse backgrounds face far harder task in getting to a stage where they're able to get into university. Why is that? Firstly, there's an unequal starting point as regards their schools. Achievement is often based on how good your education is right at the start of school. And when your facilities and teaching are either very good because you went to a private school, or very good because you went to a school in a comfortable middle-class area where parents can get the best teachers and teachers are happiest to go, it means that you get a far better start right out of the gate. Furthermore, schools can coach for specific access, how to write a good application to university, and so they're better able to get people into these places when they can do that. Secondly, we think parental background is important. You get more nurturing at home and you get more reading. We think the reason you get less of this from poorer socioeconomic backgrounds is because there isn't necessarily a built-up culture of valuing education. Not because it isn't something that's valued, but because it's just something they don't historically have a family tradition of doing, and so don't necessarily perceive the benefits of doing so. Ultimately, they might still be supportive, in fact we expect they are, but they don't know just how far these benefits extend. Thirdly, we think there's a sociological issue. Because these institutions are so heavily dominated by single socioeconomic groups or ethnic groups at the moment, there is a perception that these institutions, when you're from a different group, that they are not for you. And not just the fact that they're not for you, but that the best ones aren't for you. What does this mean? It means you don't apply at all because you don't think it's the kind of thing your person does, a person who's like you. But even if you do apply, you tend to apply to somewhere less good. You tend to apply to somewhere where you could get into somewhere better because you don't visualise yourself as being the type of person who goes to Harvard, or who goes to Yale, who goes to Vermont. Like slight institutional bias aside. And you don't necessarily apply to the best. Ultimately, we change that message by saying this is the thing that's best for you. Fourthly, we think it's harder for you when you are an individual in a minority background to work in some situations. Look at the study Levitt conducted in Chicago schools that says that the better you do, the more unpopular you get. There are costs that face certain racial groups that do not apply to other racial groups. What this means, what these 4 points mean, is that by the time we get to the application process, people who are as good as each other according to the tests have faced vastly different obstacles. People who appear less good have faced such obstacles that they're probably better. And we think it's right that we account for this.
On that, yeah. So in the American context, are you comfortable with a situation in which an upper middle class black applicant takes priority over a white student that was raised in a trailer park in Arkansas?
Obviously we've got 2 criteria here, so there's obviously going to be a trade-off between the 2. And we think it's reasonable that if socioeconomic background is something that universities underrepresent, they'd probably both be considered applicants for affirmative action programs. We don't think we necessarily have to choose between these 2 paradigms. We think we should account for both of them. And I don't think that that's, forcing us out, that's legitimate. So secondly, why is it so difficult for universities to cater for this? We think judgment on applications is often based on a snap judgment, essentially. No, thank you. There are many applications, a huge number of applications to process for universities, as many as 50 per place for certain courses. And so, we think you have to take a very limited amount of time to consider whether they might have a background that's harmful to them, and I think that's a very difficult individual assessment to make. Furthermore, admissions are likely to be highly risk-averse. You want to minimise disruption in your class, and you've got very little incentive to take the risk of taking on somebody from a poor background. Ultimately, the benefits that are likely to accrue are hugely marginal. The costs, by contrast, could be very significant. You could take somebody who might be disruptive due to their background, and that might mean that you disrupt the class in the way in which you're portrayed as an educator or as an institutional administrator is worse. Ultimately, this means that you're less likely to take that kind of risk. No thanks. What this does is it changes it, but it also makes universities go as outreach to disadvantaged schools so that they can select more carefully and pushes them to break down the barriers that I spoke about earlier. Openly.
Okay. Are you comfortable always preferencing the rich black guy and the poor white guy over a rich white guy who also happens to have struggled because he's a homosexual?
It's probably unlikely for that sort of thing to come out in applications. The question's about diverse groups, okay? To the extent that there are diverse groups present, we're happy to account for any we're happy to account for any obstacles you might have faced. These are the type of policies we're looking to put in place. We're looking to consider background. We're looking at overriding just academic achievement. Okay? So why is it beneficial to put in diverse candidates? Ultimately, we think that this benefits firstly the diverse groups. These people have better access to higher learning, and they have better access to things like networks for career progression. Ultimately, we think that's very important when they get to meet people who can help them later in life. It's also important for their other community members because it breaks down the visualization effects I spoke about earlier. It means they can now visualize people as going to the best universities. Because when somebody who lives near you has gone to Cambridge, ultimately that's something you can see that is possible for people like you to do. Thirdly, it changes the academic environment. You're often taught by your peers at university, you benefit from them. And having this idea of a differing lived experience is very, very valuable. Because understanding social deprivation and poverty is very difficult when you're a middle-class white person from the United Kingdom and you're doing a course on social deprivation. Ultimately, the perspective of other people who have experienced this is likely to enrich your learning and make you a better candidate. We think there is a degree of epistemology of provenance where these people have a better idea of what it is to understand about what it is, how they interact. Ultimately, the diverse candidates we're looking to provide benefits to are people who will have faced huge obstacles in getting to this point. And to judge them purely on their standards as they get to university is not a meritocratic thing to do. We think that you should judge them more fairly, and that's why we're happy to support quotas for them. Thank you.
I thank that speaker for his remarks, and this House is now pleased to welcome the Leader of the Opposition to open up the case for the opposition bench.
Great. Mr. Speaker, this round is not about whether or not diversity is good. And it is not about whether it is harder to grow up poor or harder to grow up rich. Assuredly, it is harder to grow up poor. I have no doubt about that. What James says is undebatably true. What this round is about is the best mechanism with which to get diversity in different universities, with which to get diversity at elite schools. So we are happy to defend that universities should do things like have generous financial aid policies, that they should use things like diversity as a weight when they are considering what applicants to take. So generally, we think universities should admit students based on merit. But we think as a part of that, as they already do, they take into consideration the personal circumstances of people. We're happy to defend, and we are defending, that universities should consider diversity as a factor in applications, and the value added that different people from minorities or different socioeconomic backgrounds can add to a university in terms of dialogue or types of people on that campus. I think that defending this, as opposed to quotas, actually has a lot of distinct advantages that simply quotas don't afford. So I'm going to do three things. First of all, I'm going to talk about how when you use quotas, you uniquely undermine the place of minorities on campus. I'm going to talk about how it's bad to put policy-making decisions in university administrators instead of the admissions officers. And finally, I'm going to talk about the long-run consequences of this. First, two pieces of quick rebuttal. So they tell us that universities make staff judgments. This is just typically empirically false. Universities put a great deal of time and consideration into applicants. They read extensively written personal essays, they weight different factors like test scores, and they actually look to see what box you've checked when it says what race you are. So I just think it's false they make snap judgments. Even if they do take snap judgments, I think when they weight diversity as a factor, they take into that consideration. Even if they're risk averse, though, even if you buy that, I still don't think it's true that they're as risk averse as they make out. We tell you that oftentimes universities look for the compelling stories of applicants because they recognize that they need different types of people on campus. And this is certainly doable when you take diversity into account as a factor. But we also just tell you that oftentimes admissions officers are people who are young and recently graduated from universities. So they are well situated to understand what it might mean to be a minority on that campus and are more likely to take these people into consideration. They also have an incentive to be progressive because they want their universities to appear as social institutions that are on the edge of moving forward in society. So there's actually an increased incentive to take diversity into consideration, especially when there aren't hard and fast rules. That said, what's the positive matter we're going to bring? So first of all, we tell you that when you use quotas, you uniquely undermine the place of minorities, both in society generally and on campus. So we tell you that to a certain extent, when you either take diversity into consideration or when you use quotas, that people will likely underweight the quality of achievement of the people. They will accuse you didn't get in because of merit, you just got in because you're black or because you happen to be poor. But we think it is far worse when there are hard and fast rules about exactly how many people you take in. And that when you take in a certain number of people, you have more students on campus assuming that their peers got in only because of race as opposed to one factor in an application. As say someone wrote a particularly compelling story about where they gave up. We think the reasons we got the POIs we did from our half about how it might be more difficult to grow up just extremely poor as opposed to rich and black are able to weight these considerations much better than when you just use a strict formula. But we also tell you that culture is generally negatively affected in another form of stigma. Because when you use quotas, you are more likely to take in people who are less well qualified to be in a university. That is just true in terms of merit or in terms of something like SAT score. The problem here is that then both students and people in society are more likely to use these examples as confirmation of the fact that minorities generally don't belong on this campus. We think that problem is much more reduced when diversity is merely a factor in an application. We think that it might be for many people better to get good grades at a slightly worse college, say maybe an institution like Cornell or something like that, I don't know, than it is to get really horrible grades at a slightly better college. But with that, I'll take Cornell.
When you have points assigned, and that's how you're taking into account diversity, that means every single person on that campus benefited, which means everyone is tagged with the fact that they might not have been there accepted. If it's a quota system making the difference between 8% and 10%, a much smaller number of the diverse population that's now involved benefited from your policy. Doesn't that mean less stigma, not more?
Certainly not. On either side of the house, there are some minorities who would have gotten in simply based on merit. But when you use a hard and fast rule, say it has to be 12% or 40% or whatever number, we think you're likely to be much farther away from that. So even if you might have slightly fewer minorities on campus, we think the overall culture and representation of them is much better, both while they're at university and when they move on. The second thing we want to talk about is how it's been uniquely harmful to limit administrators. So recognize that at most universities, that the people who admit students are young, recent graduates, people who tend to be progressive and have a good understanding of what it is like to be involved in the culture at a particular school. However, when you have university administrators setting policy, they are far more often people who maybe graduated 30 years ago and have a much less specific understanding of a particular university. We think they're likely to set badly adjusted quotas, or simply likely to not want to change quotas after a number of years. So we think in a situation like this, it's often going to be the case that you have older administrators who simply care less about diversity administering quotas. We think that's more harmful for the overall place of diversity than simply allowing admissions officers who tend to be younger, more progressive, to take diversity into account as a factor. We think ultimately we set up a far better incentive structure and one that is also much more responsive to change in terms of what minorities are in what different social places. The final thing we want to talk about is just how this can oftentimes have problematic long-run and unintended consequences. So on one level, there's simply just a problem with people like employers or future associates of minorities who are likely to believe you probably only got into this institution because of an explicit quota. Recognize that quotas oftentimes have a much higher level of stigma in society writ large than something like weight this as a factor, like you might normally do with an application essay. So we think that's particularly problematic. But also, institutional rules of universities tend to be relatively static and ossify relatively quickly. So we think that perhaps in 10 or 15 years, when it might really be the case that 10% of admissions really were of a particular minority, that if a quota is set at 8, that administrators and admissions officers will simply want to fill minorities up to the quota and not actually fill them up to the correct proportion. We think they're more likely to just stop at the quota rather than going above and beyond that, like they would when they simply take it into account. We think in the long run, this is a much more progressive policy and a policy that is much better suited to actually introducing diversity to campuses and improving the place of minorities. Happy to oppose.
I thank that speaker for his remarks. The House now recognizes the Deputy Prime Minister.
The question in this debate, having heard opening opposition, is fairly straightforward. It's not about the value of diversity, but instead about mechanisms. Their mechanism is a repetition of the status quo, which has failed for generations in terms of promoting levels of diversity. But one, for some reason, they believe because you have young people making the decision, let's assume that's true, will somehow lead to change. I want to explain several reasons why that isn't the case. First, dealing with the arguments we hear from the previous speaker. One, he tells you college administrators are currently very good at making those decisions. Firstly, if that was true, he would really struggle to explain why places like Cambridge or indeed Oxford had next to no black students overall. I presume the explanation is not that black people are less able to get into those universities, and presumably structural reasons. Instead, no explanation as to why that's the case. I'll give you several potential explanations. One, something which James told you they never responded to, is those individuals never applied to those universities in the first place. Either because they don't apply to university, because they don't see it to be for them, or even when they do well, they don't apply to the top universities because they really see that is something which isn't reasonable for them. That changes what you deliberately say in the first place, that we are looking for people from your background, so more of you apply. But secondly, when you change the incentives of the college themselves to try and appeal to these people, because you don't just want a few members of the minority, you by and large want the best people from that minority. And when you have resource constraints of who you appeal to, right now you might go to the middle class schools, we give you an incentive to try and look at other schools. So that's the first reason why you don't think the status quo works. Secondly, we do think there are time constraints. He tells you that, all the time that people make decisions can care deeply about it. I'll give you a very plausible reason why they don't. If you look again at Cambridge, you have 13,000 people, 13,000 undergraduates. Every single year you have in excess of 100,000 people applying. It is simply implausible you can put the due care in each and every one of those situations. And by and large what you do instead is make snap judgments, at least in some cases. We're not happy about that idea. Secondly on this, we still think that risk aversion is a problem. That if you're a college administrator and you allow someone in who ends up doing very badly, that looks really, really bad on you. However, if you don't let someone in who might go to another university who might do quite well, it's near impossible to look at the counterfactual, i.e. there's no direct idea of what you did wrong. So you're risk averse because you don't take that risk in the first place. And that's all the reasons we don't think college administrators are particularly good. I'm going to tell you about why college administrations might be good, because they say they're young. I don't know why being young means you're necessarily progressive. There's plenty of people who are young who aren't particularly progressive. But secondly says, well, the highest ups are going to be like 30 years old. I mean, that would be a problem had we left the decisions to the individual colleges. We're doing mandating this on a state level in terms of what those quotas should be, so I don't think that's a serious problem. Let's look at the other arguments he makes. He says, this undermines those individuals who do well. I think actually this is a really quite an interesting argument, that maybe to some degree you'll think abstractly that lots of the black people who are in your college don't deserve to be there. That might be true at a group level. It almost certainly won't be true at an individual level, which is to say, when you meet those individuals, when you work with those individuals, which uniquely in colleges and universities you have to do, you go to classes with them, if they are good and if they are able, they often break down that stigma in the first place by showing themselves to be good. And that is far more important in terms of breaking down the kind of patronizing claims they make. Secondly, implicitly, he might be arguing that the advantage of this that the negative of the policy is that it makes individuals who have got it anyway feel a little bit bad about themselves. I think by and large those individuals will still feel pretty good when they get into a great university. I think that on the margin is a fairly small benefit.
Great.
Then he says, well, then he says, you'll always assume that the individuals got in were less qualified. You will, right up until you meet them. That is yet again only true at the group level and on the overall level. Finally, he says, well, you won't allow lots and lots of individuals, you'll just hit the quota, you won't go above the quota. That might be true to begin with, but it won't be true in the long run. Why? For the reasons James tells you. One, more individuals apply. Secondly, you go more normalized to the idea that those people should be going to university, and those people are able. You break down some of those prejudices, and then you are far more likely to go above that quota in the first place, and that's where the quota becomes irrelevant. Bottom half.
Okay. Do you think the election of a black president in the United States has been superficially or concretely meaningfully beneficial for the African American population?
I mean, I think in some ways it would be concretely beneficial to the African-American population. I think it probably has raised aspirations of some people, made quite a few people feel that the society could be better for them, and maybe it could have been slightly better, but I still think in general it has some benefits overall. Let's look at the other argument they make, which is who benefits as a result of this policy. Because I think this is probably the most interesting stuff, which the opposition kind of were hinting at, that those individuals who gain will by and large be, for instance, middle-class members of a minority. The first thing to point out, this is presumably only true when you use racial quotas rather than socioeconomic quotas as well. But even in those circumstances, we're okay with it. Why are we okay with the rich or the middle class or rich black person being prioritized over, say, middle class white person in university admissions? For a couple of reasons. Firstly, even though that they have had benefits from one axis of their lives, i.e. their wealth, they are often discriminated against still because they are black, or still because of the racial group they are in. I.e., they suffer from narratives of racial betrayal, that if you apply, you are doing something which is wrong to your entire class and your entire race. Secondly, in many parts of their everyday life, they have still suffered. They still suffer from discrimination. They may not suffer in the same way because you don't have good schools. There's still definitely a harm. There's certainly a reason why we think those individuals should themselves be prioritized. But how about those individuals who lose? We're more than happy to say that, unfortunately, that you do have limitations in numbers, and there will be individuals who lose as a result of this policy. Unfortunately, sometimes when you're a member of a dominant group, you gain advantages qua being a member of that group. And it's unfortunate that you might not be the person who gained the most advantages, but like all levels of public policy, we think we have to accept that to some degree. There will be some individuals who are harmed, but by and large, there are more benefits overall. What were those benefits? The benefits of diversity in the school environment and the ideas you get overall. The benefits of role model. This presumably deals directly with what James just tells us in a POI, where he says, do you gain actual benefits or just superficial benefits by individuals of a different group, of your group doing well? Often real benefits, because it changes the very idea of what you believe you are capable of doing. That individuals, because they are poor or because they are black, often self-select out of circumstances and networks which they could otherwise do very well in. The fact that they see people from their community or people who at least superficially like them doing well can break down those entrenched ideas of those entrenched barriers which exist with individuals' own heads, and that's hugely beneficial in terms of them exploring the opportunities. At the end of the debate, it might be that you're treating people differently by different admission standards, but because of the different lives they led, the different challenges, we think that it's legitimate. There is no other way of doing it. The status quo has failed for generations, and we are more than happy to make these changes to lead to a better society, and a more fair society. I'm very happy to propose.
We thank that speaker very much for his remarks, and this House is now pleased to welcome the Deputy Leader of the Opposition.
If you believe what Harish tells you, that the status quo has failed, I first of all encourage you to just look around the room at this university, because it seems pretty clear to me that this is a diverse campus population. I think if you go to most universities in the United States, you'll find a fairly diverse campus population. And my experience in England has been that they also have fairly diverse campus populations there. That said, we weren't actually defending the status quo, Harish. What we were saying is that the correct way to implement this policy is to require universities to consider diversity in their application processes, just not tell them you have to take exactly 300 black people. we think that raises a whole host of problems that we did not hear sufficient responses to. So I want to organize my speech around what I think the three possibilities are here. So I think the first possibility, and the one that they seem to think is the one that we should be concerned with in the round, is the case where the quota lets in people who would not be admitted on the basis solely of merit and of the value they add to the university, just in terms of what the applications committee draws out of their application. So Andrew gives you a couple of arguments at this point. So first of all, he tells you that this doesn't actually solve the problem in wider society because people will be stigmatized. And I really don't think Harish gives us a very good response to this argument. What he says is something like, clearly you guys are saying that black people are stupid if you buy into that, which is not our argument at all. What our argument very clearly was is that if you very publicly make it clear that you are going to use a quota to let in candidates because you're not getting enough qualified candidates from that racial group, people assume that the members of that racial group are underqualified. And then what happens? Well, then you have members of that group go to this university who do in fact happen to not fit in and not get the best educational outcome they could, or do just happen to be underqualified. They don't get very good grades, and then they go out into the world and no thank you. I'm going to suggest that they don't have particularly great lives because of this, because people think that, oh, you went to this university that we know has race-based quotas, you didn't get very good grades there, and now here you are applying for a job with me. Well, it seems unlikely that you're the sort of person I should be hiring. We would tell you that the way you actually fix the underlying socioeconomic and racial disparities in society is by making sure that people have access to power in business, to power in politics, to power in society beyond the university, and they don't get that on their side of the house. They hurt it. No thank you. The other thing Harish tells us is that it's necessary to have these quotas because these groups are not advertised to under the status quo. So we're perfectly willing to also mandate that universities target a certain portion of their recruiting efforts on people from traditionally disadvantaged backgrounds or on racial minorities. But I also just don't think this is true. I do think that most universities today are pretty liberal institutions that aspire to have a diverse campus where people can learn from each other, not just because they happen to have high SAT scores, but because they happen to come from diverse backgrounds. I just don't think the problem is as big as he said. But the final thing he tells us is that we need these, we need these quotas because people won't go to the university because it's perceived as a betrayal of their race. So I think if that's true, that's still true on your side of the house. I don't see how a quota fixes that. I don't actually think you've demonstrated to us that quotas are necessary. We've told you very clearly why they cause harms in this circumstance. No thank you. That said, the second circumstance we talk about, which we hear no response to whatsoever, is that in the long run, hopefully we will create a society where things like socioeconomic background, things like race, don't particularly influence your ability to get into universities. We seem to be trending in that direction right now, Mr. Speaker. I don't know if it'll ever be perfect, but I think we could get a lot closer than we are right now. The problem is that they're just going to have a legislative body institute a quota, and then you're going to have a bunch of administrators who are used to, every single year, admitting exactly 20% of the new class from a specific community. We tell you this is problematic because hopefully in the future there will be years when more than 20% of the people who are qualified to get into that university under the normal mechanism we would use come from that background. But on their side of the house, they create a subconscious bias that prevents those people from getting in. I will take first.
Okay, so you're a talented member of a minority. You don't necessarily have the highest grade.
I'm not a member of a minority, but
you go to university with a great deal of facilities. Why are you now doing badly? Why aren't you instead doing quite well in the university, getting those high-level jobs, and creating the change in business which you want?
So, I mean, there are a number of reasons this might be the case, right? Like, first of all, the university admissions committee might have looked at you and thought, wow, this person seems like they're just not a very good cultural fit for our university, but we have to let them in anyway because they are at least qualified based on SAT score and they fit the group we're concerned with. It might also just be the case that they can't hack academically, Harish, right? Like, you have a bunch of, I think you have Congress doing this. Your model wasn't super clear, but if you have Congresses setting these quotas, they have absolutely no idea what percentage of candidates are going to be at least qualified enough that they'll be able to pass their classes at these universities.
Yeah, that's on that.
No thank you. So the third circumstance I want to talk about is what we're proposing. So that circumstance is where the quota is exactly the same, it captures exactly the same populace as merit plus the value added to the university would capture. So recognize first of all that this is extremely unlikely on their side of the house. Recognize second of all this is what we want. Now why do we want it? I think we told you pretty clearly. So we agree that race matters. We agree that class matters. We think that things beyond SAT scores do matter. We also think, as I pointed out in POI, sexual orientation matters. We think regional diversity matters. We think status as an immigrant matters. We think the fact that you're a Canadian, which means it's probably harder to get into a university because you're Canadian, but also matters. But we shouldn't. I just love making number two. We think that you can't have quotas for all of these things. The best thing to do is have a group of liberal people who care about the future of the university and care about creating a diverse campus climate come to decisions. Now, on their side of the house, they have a bunch of 60-year-olds coming to these decisions, which I don't think is great because, first of all, they don't know what the current diversity of these campuses are. Second, they can't actually adjust to things like regional issues, right? Like, I think it's probably the case that you should set the quotas differently based on where the university is. But they didn't give us a finely tuned mechanism for achieving that. I think they've raised all sorts of problems. So, at the end of the day, I think there are a couple questions you need to ask yourself. The first question you need to ask yourself is, do you trust a bunch of old men who are in positions of power as presidents of universities? You're making faces at me, but most university presidents are men, and you know it, and it's bad. It's bad. Who haven't been to the university in 45 years to make judgments about what will be best for the campus climate, about what will be best for the educational outcomes of the students who go there? Or do you want people who graduated from the university within the past decade, who know what experiences they learned from at the university, and also know what groups they would have liked to see more at the university? I think that's the first question you need to ask yourself. But I think the second, more important question you need to ask yourself, and that's one that I don't think the proposition has grappled with so far in this round, is how we actually achieve the outcomes we're aiming to achieve in our society. Because I think that this is the sort of solution that is exactly the kind that we should avoid. It creates the illusion of solvency, but in fact reinforces the biases that we're trying to correct on our side of the house. And that's why we are incredibly proud to oppose.
I thank that speaker very much for his remarks, and the House is now pleased to welcome the member of government to continue the case for the entire government bench.
What I want to talk to you about today in my extension is that we basically all agree that diversity is good, but we want to talk about how we actually achieve it better under a system of quotas, rather than the vague sense of diversity through the assignment of points, which is what they're advocating, and which is what actually happens in the status quo. We think we have a far better consistent metric, which in the end will yield more diverse applicants who are better qualified and will help universities, which are the actors we're concerned with. But before I get into that, specific areas rebuttal. So first, this assumption that the people who are applying are underqualified, and that the stigma of quotas will basically haunt these people through their time through university. We don't think a quota system signals to the rest of the students everyone who is admitted on the basis of that quota is underqualified. Instead, what we think it says is that you should value these individuals because of the diversity they explicitly bring into the classroom, because they have unique life experiences, because there's a diversity of ideas, and because they challenge stereotypes and conventions of thought held by other students. And then the suggestion that it actually hurts outcomes when we have things like quotas. Yet this is empirically not true. In fact, we can look to the EOP program at the state level and the HEOP program at the federal level, along with tracing done by the American Bar Association, which looked at quota rates for law school admissions. All of these found that outcomes for minority candidates who are admitted on the basis of diversity or on quotas were exactly the same in terms of their lifelong achievement compared to their white peers. We don't think that quotas basically create a stigma so you're not going to accomplish. And then there's this sense, no thank you, that quotas, that under the quota system, we're capturing more than value added plus merit, right? That we're going to let in students who are underqualified. We don't believe that under the status quo, we're actually capturing everyone who's qualified. We think that there are a lot more qualified applicants for Yale University who are African American who never applied because they don't believe they have a shot, because they don't believe diversity is explicitly valued at Yale, whose president is like an old white man. We think we challenge that notion when we go ahead and do things like encourage diversity explicitly through the use of quotas. But onto my own substantive matter.
Before you do.
No, actually go ahead.
Yeah. Do you think it's in the slightest bit insulting to bring people to the classroom as minorities so they can enrich the educational experience of the protected white people there so they can claim to have a black friend?
No. I think that there's a diversity of ideas that come into play. I think those applicants are admitted not just on the basis of diversity, but because they also meet like the academic standards of the university. I think you're essentializing what's actually happening in this instance. But okay, we think diversity actually plays a part in the admissions process. So the way admissions works is there's basically like the assignment of points on the basis of SAT scores, GPA, and extracurricular activities. Let's say you need like 100 points to get into a university. Being LGBT might be worth 10 points. Being African American is worth 20 points. Doing debate, that's worth 40 points. If you get 100 points, guess what? You just got into Harvard. We think that there's several problems with this point system that I'm going to outline now. First, we think it's incredibly essentializing. Why? Because you're essentially assigning value to life experience. You're saying that being gay is worth less than being black. And that has a stigma in a few ways. One, we think it has an internal stigma on the part of the applicant themselves, who says like, oh, I am so cumulatively disadvantaged because I am African American that we ought to rectify that. And that disadvantage is worth more than any disadvantage I've accrued because I'm gay. But second, no thank you. We think that there's an external stigma that's passed on to the entire community, where you're basically saying like, oh, you ought to look down at this black person way more than you ought to look down at this gay person. But second, we say it's not consistent, that it changes from year to year. And we think that's really bad when we don't have consistency in the admissions process, and we're allowing it to vaguely swing the level of diversity at a school. Third, we think it's a system that's not transparent, and instead we're left with a vague sense that you got in because you're an underrepresented minority. But we think this inhibits the actual discussion of of diversity, which is what they want. Like if we want universities to go ahead and promote how great diversity is and how we need to go ahead and address the stigmas of diversity, we say we should be bold and explicit about it. But we don't think that happens in the status quo where we hide behind a vague point system. But why do we think quotas are preferable, particularly for universities? First, we think it makes it explicitly about composition. This means that we're signaling to minorities and majorities that we value diversity as an end of itself, right? We think it's worthwhile in a classroom to have diversity, not just because you have some cumulative life disadvantage you want to come over. We're not suggesting that you got a free hand in this instance, and we think that stigmatizes students and creates sort of a self-help mentality. That's not good. But second, we think it encourages applicants in the first place. We think with a quota system, a community knows that it actually has a shot at admissions in a way that it doesn't under this vague sense of points. Because under the quota system, they know that that 10% of that class will represent that minority group. That encourages them to apply. And if you listen to the government model, universities are explicitly communicating this toward applicants. We think this means that you're going to get more people applying. So what does this end up meaning for universities? We think it actually creates better quality applicants enrolling, and it does this in a few ways. First, we think it gets more people applying, which I already discussed, but sure.
So the point system that you use at Cornell is silly, but why can't you have a group of trained professionals make judgments about the applications holistically?
Okay, so the point system's used most places. I think what happens under a quota system is you still have experts making judgments holistically about an applicant, but they're also going back to the fact that we want 10% of our class to be diverse, right? That in and of itself, I think is a unique benefit to our system. But okay, what we end up getting is better yield. And the reason we get better yield of applicants is because we're saying that these individuals are actually welcomed at our community, right? Because we think what happens right now is that there's a vague sense, again, that you ought to have diversity applicants, but that is not explicitly clear that they are welcomed. Take, for example, Cornell University, where the average yield rate is 50% for an admitted applicant. But when you look at African Americans, the yield rate is 25%. What ends up happening is that the reason African Americans so consistently turn down offers of admissions to Cornell University is because there isn't a sense that they are welcomed into the community. Cornell looks like an all-white school that they don't want to be a part of. But we think when Cornell actually says no, it's important to have our class be diverse, makes that statement explicit, we're going to get better applicants actually enrolling. And what in the end does this mean? We think it creates a system which is far better. We think it creates better students in the classroom. So what have I told you in this debate so far? We basically explained that at the end of the day, we want to achieve diversity. But the best way to achieve diversity and to actually have the positive discussions that it entails is not through the vague use of points, not through the lack of transparency that occurs in the admissions process, but rather through an explicit system of quotas in which we eliminate the effects of essentializing individuals and we make it about composition and we make it a place where we know that diversity is welcome and we're able to have a frank conversation. For these reasons, we propose.
I thank our speaker very much for his remarks, and now we welcome the member of opposition opening up the case for the closing opposition team.
I understand that I'm a white bourgeois male who happens to be heterosexual and is on the counterintuitive side of this debate, which probably appeals to the heartstrings of most people. What I would like from the participants of the audience is to engage in a deeper level of interrogation and this sort of facile analysis that you get from government that ultimately is nothing more than an appeal to our white guilt so that we don't engage in critical interrogation of deeper problems. Clap. So there seems to be a consensus throughout both sides of this debate that there is a fundamental social inequality that is endemic to our society and apparently to the UK as well. Seems fair enough. But there's a lack of engagement of questions of root causes to this. There's an initial discussion of this in the first number of Opening Government about problems in more primary forms of education, problems of ghettoization, things like that. We think those are fundamentally more important issues to engage in. I'm going to talk to you about two things in this debate. One will be the fetishism of white guilt, the commodification of suffering and of minorities, and the second will be about how the plan that's being proposed is fundamentally something akin to vaudeville. It's a bomb that causes us to not engage in a more fruitful interrogation of the fundamental structures of our society. But first, I have to engage in the guy who spoke before me, who I heard is from Cornell, so that's cool. No one knows my school, whatever. So he says we need to send a message that diversity is good. If we win our arguments that this is just a facile engagement with diversity, well then this is a coax so that we don't engage in a more fundamental interrogation of social structures. It's denial. It's like putting a Band-Aid on cancer, let's say. So then their next argument is that the point system is bad. That's cool, it filled up a lot of your time in front of an audience. No one on this side is defending a point system. Crazy. Second argument is I fail to see how this is radically different from quotas. Interrupting me is okay, go.
If you're not valuing a point system, which is the way that every university does this, is your serious contention that you should have 10 people sit in a room and handpick from hundreds of thousands of applications what makes the best diverse class without quantifying that in any way, shape, or form, and still taking into account diversity?
So two things. One is that there are like broad-based point systems that aren't precise. Like my school, for example, says we aim for like a vague amount of particular groups, like 17% of Hispanics, for example. But more importantly, I'm not advocating for that. I'm advocating for a deeper interrogation of why there's an absence of minorities throughout universities. That'll become explicit in my extension. Let me continue to deal with your part. I fail to see how this is distinct from the quota system that's being provided by the government in this particular debate. We hear two net benefits that are supposedly outlined. One is that quotas engage in a shifting, which we would akin to the shifting of the flavor of the week. We can have new minorities because they aren't represented enough in our ever-diverse student population. And the second argument is a question of transparency, which I actually think makes the sort of meritocracy and stigma arguments provided by opening opposition much stronger, because now there's a very transparent engagement of quantification of diverse populations that says, well, if they fit this particular part of our pie chart, they're probably not willing, not deserving of their position in the university. The second argument we hear is we love diversity. Well, that's well and good. It puts me in a morally impoverished position where it's hard to say I'm against it, which isn't the case. But this begs the question of whether or not, one, you're engaging in the meritocracy of the opening opposition, and more importantly, it links to my substantive matter concerning fetishism, questions of root cause, and it links to a bunch of tricky problems concerning quantity, right? Like, this speaker literally referred to minority population as yields, like crops, like how much do we need every year? That's crazy talk that I think is offensive, makes me feel more guilty. And secondly, it welcomes insidious denial, please.
I accept there are root causes of this, as we talked about. We're more than happy to support policies to deal with that. And by and large, policymakers are discussing it because it's a major social issue. Can't we also deal with a symptom, which is a fairly pernicious one, and leads to many of the circular problems which you want to talk about?
No, there's a direct trade-off where in dealing with the symptom, we fool ourselves into thinking we've dealt with a fundamental problem. So that's my argument concerning fetishism. In 2003, right, in the case of the Supreme Court with Michigan, Sandra Day O'Connor, in her majority opinion, said that there was a state interest to diversify the education environment for the sake of the students present there. Your partner literally said that you're taught by your peers. What does this mean? Well, it's a super horrifying and degrading justification that says that we should have minorities within white schools that are used as props so that white kids can learn about inner city experience. That is a form of fetishism that also intervenes in the argument that we get from opening government concerning how students get to teach each other. It's not in the actual engagement of one's experiences. Rather, it's a commodification, it's a fetishization. It's just like the token minority that's present in the class, that when we bring up racism, we can be like, oh, everyone get quiet, let's see what that person has to say. And then everyone sits there awkwardly. No. Yeah, and that's really awkward. All right, the second argument I'd like to make is that this is fundamentally vaudeville. It's a bomb. It's something that assuages us from more fundamental structures within our society. The model is something that assuages white guilt. The example brought up by my partner in his POI seems kind of weird at first, but we think that Obama, a black president, causes us to think that racism is somehow solved, that it doesn't permeate our society, which is why I like Cornel West more than Obama. He takes him to task continuously about why this isn't enough, why there's an increased amount of poverty and incarceration for African Americans than there has been in the history of America in the past 10 years. Cornel West's criticism of Obama is really good. He claims that he doesn't go to inner cities, that he does things like misappropriates Martin Luther King's Bible, things like that. His presidency has caused us to continue to overlook deeper problems. Now, this all sounds very negative, and indeed I'm on the opposition, so that's sort of our game. But I need to provide something positive so the judges think they should vote for me. So what would we advocate? We think that yes, there are probably less minorities in schools like Harvard and schools like Cornell, right? But you should know, first of all, that there's a mitigation of the harms they're talking about because those minorities can still go to state schools. But more importantly, there's a realization that the harms of the status quo are perpetuated as systematic poverty and marginalization. That entails reforming schools at a lower level, dealing with the failure of primary schools. What they call role modeling, we call puppeteering, that doesn't allow for serious reform. They are a micro-meritocracy, and our argument is that is a facade that actually precludes real change. Remember, affirmative action was instituted in the 60s and 70s as a temporary action, and simultaneously there was an increase in poverty, an increase of crime, an increase of deterioration of social structures in ghettos and inner cities. Those problems still have not to be dealt with. Their solution is like round two, do it again? No, we think you should engage in a more fundamental interrogation of the structures that cause things like racism, discrimination, socioeconomic exploitation, things like that. It seems like they have the moral high horse. I ask you to look deeper into these issues and not engage in a band-aid solution for something that is destroying this room.
I thank that speaker for his remarks, and we welcome the final speaker for the government bench, the government whip. Hear, hear.
The grand solution that was proposed in the last speech was that we should have more critical study of race-based issues in these societies where this is happening. We think one of the ways that you have more critical study is that in universities, you encourage such a study. When do we think that study is more likely? We think it's much more likely when you have a substantial minority population that has been disadvantaged, that will either study themselves or will expose the problems of other people that will then get involved and become allies and fight that. So does this stop the problem of racism or income inequality? No, of course not. Does it make it better, even if it might have some drawbacks? We think it makes it better both in the short term and in the long term by encouraging the exact solution that they want to go forward. So what do I think are the main issues in today's debate? What we've been brought with is a comparative debate, at least for the first three teams, right? We said that what was brought up was either programs that take into account diversity, other affirmative action programs, which we'd say largely are the point system. There's been no other alternative that's been brought up other than like Council of Elders style, but I'll deal with both, right? Or have an explicit quota system. What I'm going to talk about, the 2 points of crystallization, are why we think that the quota system is better than points or elders in both the stigma that we think is going to come forward and the actual effect on composition. Before we do that, some specific rebuttal of vaudeville and fetishism. Right? What they say is that people are being brought in as props, right? Everyone look and learn about this person. We'd say that there's a huge difference between saying having a diverse campus where you will interact with diverse people and having a classroom where one student is made the exhibit. Those are two different things, and it's not what's being brought up by universities. It's not exhibit A, we need them here. It's let's have a diverse community so that your informal conversations, you are exposed to more things outside of the classroom. Right? And second of all, we'd say that it's also one where everyone is learning about different cultures. It's not only bringing minorities in so that the white people learn about it, it's one where you have an exchange of all kinds of ideas and life experiences, so we don't say it's one that's inherently biased to one side or the other. Go ahead.
And
milking people for educational capital. Like, I understand that the facade is attractive. You obviously don't literally call people Exhibit A. You just ask them to study themselves and inform us about their socioeconomic status.
No, we actually ask everyone to study themselves, and we ask everyone to be reflective and then to interact with everyone else on campus. We don't milk one individual person. You're great at using these words that like make things sound terrible, that are actually normal ideas. Then let's talk about like this superficial versus beneficial idea that they brought up, right? We think that there's a difference between something that is beneficial and superficial. We also think that one idea can be both beneficial and superficial, right? So when DNA testing was brought into the criminal system, we think that was beneficial in terms of getting things accurate, but that also some people thought that like all crimes were now solved, and that might have been a superficial harm. What you need to weigh is whether having more diversity, the benefits of it might outweigh any superficial harm. We think the arguments made by first government, first opposition, and second government have all shown you that those benefits outweigh, right? Then he talks about like affirmative action and poverty have happened at the same time, right? Just because they've happened at the same time doesn't mean that they're correlated, first of all. And second of all, like all income in America has fallen in the last 30 years. We don't think those affirmative actions fall. Now let's get into the real debate, which is about whether the point system or elders is better, or whether a quota system is better. No thank you, right? We think, I'm going to analyze this on two, on stigma and on composition, right? When it comes to stigma, we get a few arguments as to why the point system is better. Oh, well, go ahead.
So it might be true that on your side of the house, you have slightly more minorities on campus in absolute sense. But unfortunately, it is also true that they are the students who are the least likely to get in under American.
I promise I'll get to that on effects of composition. We'll talk about it.
I just want to ask.
Thank you.
Doesn't this mean that they're the students most likely
Thank you.
to contribute to bias and stigma?
Thank you.
Just
Okay, let's talk about the different ways to do this. I promise I'll get that on composition. That's why I tagged it, right? So let's talk about why we think there are two different systems. Either you have Ohio State getting like 200,000 applications, or some university getting 50,000 applications, and you have 10, 20 people sit in a room, read each individual one, and holistically make a class out of that. We'd say that's impossible to get done in a year. We also think it's very arbitrary in terms of each person having their own conception. The way this works in the real world, when you want to like benefit people from poorer communities, the real way colleges do it is they assign points. Whether that's formal or informally, they give a guideline to the readers saying you should value this approximately this much, and that's how it boosts up. No. Why is that worse for stigma, right? They say you'll be they say that like it'll be worse. Well, they say it'll be worse under our system because it's explicit that you got in under a quota, right? We'd say there are a few differences. The first, as Danny points out, is under this affirmative action policy, every single person from that minority group got those explicit points and got in because of that. So we think on both sides, you're saying there's a disadvantage to being a minority. Under their side, you're essentializing it and quantifying it. You're saying being black is negative 10 points, and so we'll raise your application 10 points in terms of getting in. We think that's much worse for sending a stigma to everyone else in society when you're ascribing a specific value to that experience that you've had, right? No, right? But second of all, they say like, you'll be disadvantaged in the future because you'll have worse applicants getting in. But note that Danny says the ABA has studied law schools and found minority candidates do no worse. The HEOP and EEOP programs for letting underprivileged minorities into American schools show that they have actually done no worse. No thank you, right? We'd say, in fact, what you want to do in fighting the stigma is take the bold stance, saying we will put a quota out there, we will own the system that we put because it brings all these other benefits to the rest of the community. We are fine to own that, we will not hide behind it and shift our point scale each time. Then how do we deal with composition, right? Why do we think we lead to better composition? They say you're getting lower quality applicants, lower quality people in. Then explain to you why the class is actually going to be a higher quality for two reasons. The first is when you have an explicit quota system, you're going to encourage more people to apply. Because it's very clear that you value that community and that they have a better chance of getting in, and so more of those people who apply, so the quality that's left on the table will come in. The second is that they have a higher yield. Now no, that's not yield like crops. That's yield in terms of people that accept your offer of admission, right? And know that that is much lower amongst minority groups in some colleges because they aren't seen as valued. They get in, but they say, I'll have a terrible experience there. I'm not actually going to be valued. I'm not actually going to have other people that I can interact with. By having that explicit quota system where you know you're going to have people of the community that you can interact with, and you know that you're going to be valued, we think it's more likely that they will accept this admission and you have higher quality people entering into it. What we have in this debate is comparative. We have a point system that is failing and is centralizing, and we have a quota system that would achieve these benefits far better. We're very proud to propose.
We thank that speaker very much for those remarks and invite the final speaker of the debate, the opposition whip.
I just want to begin by apologizing for my partner's tricky use of words to Cornell. The SAT requirements tell me are much higher, so vocab is on our side. That's a joke because they're actually not. They go to a crappy school, we know. Okay, so this is how this debate went. We had a discussion of the mechanism comparison where everybody kind of agreed on the substance, and that was kind of boring and awkward. And then they said some things about us defending a point system, which we don't necessarily. And then James said some really cool stuff about why affirmative action is just profoundly bad when done as quotas for our society writ large, and why it hasn't worked in the past and won't in the future, etc. So my job is pretty easy, because I'm just here to persuade you that we're the best. What I'm going to do first is explain why closing government's responses to James' material fail. Then I'm going to sum up the debate on two questions. The first is, how does this policy actually affect minorities that are in colleges? And secondly, how does it affect social justice in general? Okay, so the first thing, on James. We get this response. He misunderstood our argument to be that, like, we're saying by critical interrogation, we mean, like, literally we need more people, like, researching race issues. Like, we need more people investigating race issues. And he's like, well, who would do that more than minorities? No. What we're saying is that in the public political psychology, right now, there is a balm over the great sore that is racism, because we say, like, hey, we have a black president. Hey, I saw a black person at Harvard. Clearly we're solving the issues of race in our society, and we don't need to do things like fund early education programs or like funding to actually have lunch for kids who are in poverty. Like, we don't need to do those basic things that might actually change the structural reality of racism in our country, okay? So we're not saying, like, we need more people in, like, studying the issue. Like, we know what the facts are. They're pretty clear. What we lack is political will. That political will evaporates when the reality is you have these kinds of facades that prevent the kind of political impetus that would actually get at those root issues. That was our argument. You didn't respond to that one, unfortunately for you. Then he was like, what do you mean, vaudeville? We're not going to put these people in an exhibit. And, like, there's a reason everybody had, like, an embarrassing laughter response to what James said. That's that's true, okay? That's when comedy works, is when the audience, like, relates and empathizes with the experience. That's my warrant for that argument, literally, is that you all know it's true, okay? The fact of the matter is, it may not be an exhibit box, but the reality is we bring people into that classroom, and we have minorities for the educational diversity experience of the people in that classroom. What else would that mean? It means I get to enrich my experience by virtue of you being there as somebody from the experience. Like, if that's not essentializing them, I don't know what is. Like, what does the university think? They're going to get a particular kind of experience from having an African American in the class. They're going to say particular kinds of predictable things that are going to be beneficial for the white students in the class. That's messed up. That's weird. There are people like Clarence Thomas, and they'd be like, oh, wow, that wasn't what we were expecting, which is offensive, right?
Would you have desegregated the schools, even though it might have given the appearance that we were doing more than we were?
I'm just gonna, I think I would have desegregated the schools. Yeah, okay. And I don't think those issues are entirely analogous, and I'm not gonna waste my whip speech, like, explaining that. Okay, so the next thing. What we say is that, I can't read my own writing. Yeah, okay, that's enough on his argument, I think. Yeah, I don't read that at all. Okay, so the two questions. I don't read that at all. The first question is minorities and colleges, in a second, Rich. So what do we get from the opening government? They want to use pretty much a broad brush. We tried to get James to, like, admit this in his first speech, and he kind of wavered on it. He was like, well, we'll just let everybody in. That's our policy. And then Harish got on us, and he was like, okay, in the United States context at least, we're not going to take care of, like, the poor kid from Arkansas. He's screwed. But we are going to take care of the upper middle class black kid. So I appreciate that, Harish. But what does this mean? Okay, a few consequences of this degrading broad brush policy of quotas. Okay, point number one, exhibit A, would be that it's failed. All right, we've used the quota system. We use aggressive quota systems, the kind that Harish wants to have social transformation, and it's correlated with not just not good things happening, but really bad things happening simultaneously. The increased poverty, increased drug use in communities that were targeted by those quotas, increased destruction of the social structure of those communities. Okay, if it were effective, we wouldn't have that kind of correlation taking place on a pretty profound level. But more so, even if that's not going to replicate, we have the analysis from James that basically it's unfair, for example, to people who are qualified otherwise but not getting in. Secondly, that we use them as props and fetishize them so that they can add value to our experience in a way that I think is fundamentally degrading. And we hear from opening opposition as well that in terms of peer perception, these people are told the people around them can make a very solid inference that they are less intelligent than them. Why? Because socially, we make the assumption that GPA and SAT scores are correlated with your intelligence. It's not cool to be in a college where everybody around you can make a reasonable inference that you're not as good as they are. And that's what we did here as well from opening opposition, was something like that. Go ahead.
Okay. So let's say we believe you and you've essentialized people by asking them to give their viewpoints. You're also giving them an education at the best universities. I think that's a trade-off that is probably worth it.
Okay, I'll explain why it's not in my social justice point. Closing government then tells us that we're going to get more qualified applications, and all of this depends on some kind of like weird point system versus what they're doing analysis. We don't defend the point system, but even more so, if you believe what Harish is saying, which is that they want aggressive quotas, then all of the things that they're worried about are going to be magnified. Like the people in your classroom, if it's an aggressive quota system, are more likely to be there because of the aggressive quota system, as opposed to the point system. Like everything you guys said about the point system applies to the quota system if it's done aggressively. A quota means like we need 25% of our student population to be black. So that means like under normal circumstances, if about 5 or 6% of your population be black, you can count on the fact that a lot of people are there and wouldn't be there otherwise. That's worse for like everything you guys said about the point system, which we don't defend in the first place. Okay, let's get to social justice. Opening government says this will help with the opening government says like this will help in the long run with like getting more meritocratic systems. Here's why it doesn't. Here's why James Extension wins us this debate. Because our point is that quotas themselves and the whole policy around them prevent real policies that can change. I'll give you a really quick example. Wealthy people don't give as much as poor people in this country, but when they do give their money, they give it to universities and endowments and things like that because they think universities are a source of real social transformation. And it's an absolute hoax. It's a lie. But they think that it's reality because they hear that there are things like quotas and affirmative action. And they see like really good pamphlets and brochures where like we're changing society one face at a time. And we're absolutely not. During the Obama administration, the black community has had a worse time than any other race. Not just worse overall because of the recession, but worse than any other race. And Obama's done nothing about it. He's said nothing about it. He hasn't worked on their behalf. And Cornel West pointed that out. The reason why we're okay with that kind of reality is because we have a black president in this country now. And the reason we're okay with not funding these programs is because we have affirmative actions and quotas in our universities. It covers up the blister and sore that is the racial divide in this country. We can do something about that, but it requires, first of all, rejecting these policies that would allow us to continue in a crippling kind of social world where we think that this is an actual solution. We want the rich to actually invest in these things. We want political psychology to turn on behalf of these people in a meaningful way. That only happens when we stop fetishizing these people, using them for our own purposes of white guilt, or absolving ourselves of our own white guilt, and you get that particularly out of the analysis from closing opposition. We're very proud to oppose.